All right, good afternoon. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome back to Legal Studies 160. This is going to be lecture 24. That doesn't sound right. Getting to be one of the last lectures. Community corrections, less crime and fewer prisoners, question mark. So just to remind us how little time we have left, this is the last of, I guess, four remaining classes, sort of the last 2 weeks. We have today and tomorrow and then next week, and I think your reading period begins after that, and we won't be meeting as a class during that reading period. Basically what I hope to do this week is sort of round out, in a way, our tour of penal sanctions in the era of mass incarceration, to take into account community corrections, which, as we'll see, is a big part of what currently forms essentially mass incarceration in our society, but perhaps paradoxically is a big part of what's being offered to us as a solution to how to move away from mass incarceration. On Thursday, we're going to look at what, for many people, is sort of the emerging model for an alternative that would truly be a step away from, rather than a sort of, as many fear for community corrections, really just a prolongation of the process of sending people back and forth to prison, and that's restorative justice. While we can hardly do justice to a topic that could be the subject of its own class, I've asked you to read a piece that sort of looks at some of the philosophical backgrounds to restorative justice, and then in class I'm going to play you a short film that's available on the web, but we'll watch it together in class so we can talk about how it might work, perhaps in conjunction with forms of community corrections to help anchor a new system that's less focused on incarceration than our current one has been. Then next week, we're going to come back to the beginning of the class, and we're going to spend our last 2 days basically on Brown versus Plata, the 8th Amendment case from last year that has put California on the path, at least for the moment, of prison population reductions, and which I suggested at the very beginning of the class seemed to me to open a door to potentially a new, more human rights-oriented approach to punishment and its evolution in the future. The readings for that will basically be Brown versus Plata, the Supreme Court opinion, which was a recommended reading for the very first day of class. Now I want you to actually read it. And then what's essentially the introduction to my book. Hopefully it will be in press this summer. You can have it for Christmas vacation, or Christmas presents, or Hanukkah presents next December, hopefully. You'll get the introduction to that as the reading for the final class on sort of the future directions of punishment in a hopefully a more upbeat ending to the course than we've had before. Okay, so let me turn to today's topic of community corrections and the promise that's been repeatedly made that we could actually have less crime and fewer prisoners. Right? If the last 40 years have been the promise of less crime by having more prisoners, we are once again turning to the notion that we could find some other means of punishment, an alternative to the prison, that would actually give us perhaps even less crime with less prisoners. So I think the place to start here is actually realignment in California, and it's a rather complex and at the same time very stealth policy. You heard Representative Skinner last week, in effect, suggest that it's probably a good thing that it's kind of a stealth policy. In a way, the less Californians talk about what realignment really means in terms of moving away from prison-based public safety in California, the better. I think that's a notion I disagree with. I think sooner or later we're going to have a public discussion as a state about our level of fear and how realistic it is, our ways of addressing that fear and how realistic they've been. I actually think we're not going to be able to avoid that for long. And so, even though I understand why our elected representatives don't look forward to that conversation, I think we need to be ready for it. So let's take a look at sort of what realignment is doing. And there are really sort of 3 pieces of it for our purposes that I think I want you to pay attention to. One is indeed, and this is Representative Skinner talks about all 3 of these pieces, but especially this piece when she was here last week, the change in sentencing. Basically, the Criminal Justice Realignment Act will eliminate state prison as an option for sentencing for a variety of felons that meet essentially a triple set of no's or nots. They're not a violent offender. That is, the felony they've been convicted of is not a violent crime. It's not a serious crime. And it's hard to believe it could be not either of those and still a sex crime, but it can't be one of those either. And that, if it meets those triple nots, then state prison is actually removed as a potential sanction. And instead, county jail, which had historically been an option for some felonies in this category, but just an option, will now be essentially the exclusive sanction, and with a very important caveat that there is no longer to be a time limit on the amount of time that may be served in county jail. Historically, it was a year, was the maximum amount of time you could be sentenced to serve in the county jail as a penalty for a felony. And now, in theory, if the sentence would be 15 years in state prison, then a judge would sentence you to 15 years to be served in the county jail. Now, the part of this sentencing shift that is more stealth, however, and is not particularly spelled out in the slide, which comes from the courts section of the California government website, and I'll post these slides for you, is that counties have considerable discretion to take those felons that they can now put in the county jail for months and years if they choose to, and instead put them on various forms of non-incarceral penalties. For instance, house arrest, electronic monitoring in the community, and some form of probation, potentially restorative justice, as perhaps in combination with some of the others. And the counties have been given essentially discretion to decide whether there are people who meet the criteria of being low enough risks to be handled through that kind of non-incarceration-based penalty. So realignment is arguably the first step towards sentencing reform in California. It designates a whole bunch of felons or felony crimes which had been resulting in prison sentences, and it basically takes prison off the table with the caveat that it could be no more than a switch from prison to jail. And jails historically have been viewed as not a very good alternative for incarcerating prisoners, certainly not for longer periods of time. And to the extent that we're interested in rehabilitation or restoring a little bit more emphasis on rehabilitation, jails are at best a mixed blessing. On one hand, they're closer to counties, they're closer to the community, and in places like Alameda County, San Francisco County, you've had fairly progressive sheriffs that have developed more rehabilitative programming in some of the county jails than has been true of our prison system overall. But at least historically, jails have not been seen as a very promising place to rehabilitate people. So that puts a lot of emphasis, if this is actually going to be a significant shift in California punishment away from incarceration, to the ability of counties to convince themselves that it's politically okay to use their discretion to keep people out of jail to begin with. So the second piece of realignment that is probably next to, as Nancy Skinner was explaining, nobody's actually being released early from prison in order to create the prison population reductions that the courts have ordered. Instead, we're sending fewer people to prison to begin with, and therefore creating that 30 to 40,000 prisoner reduction in population. One way we do that is by sending them to prison. We're taking prison off the table for the non-violent, non-serious, non-sex offenders, and they get sent either to county jail or maybe some county alternatives to incarceration. The second piece of that is the change in post-release community supervision. From the late 70s until the present, virtually all California prisoners were given a release date based on their determinate sentence for their crime. The big exception to that, of course, and we talked about these, are lifers who have a life sentence. Historically in California, all of those determinate sentence prisoners, even though they didn't get released early on parole, as they were historically in pre-1977, they were placed on what was known as parole supervision, which is strictly speaking a form of post-release community supervision, for a period of 1 to 3 years. In practice, virtually everybody was kept for 3 years. And during that time, of course, they were on conditions of parole that subjected them to regular inspection by parole officers, made them eligible for treatment and various kinds of services to help them reintegrate into the community. But if you read the pieces I asked you to read today from the mass incarceration special issue, you'll know that very little real treatment or services went along with that in California. And so as a result, lots of people went from parole back to prison. And a lot of them went back to prison not for committing a new crime, or at least a new crime that anybody proved against them, but instead for violating the conditions of their parole, often a technical violation, which could mean turning in a dirty drug test, missing appointments, relocating without the permission of your parole officer. Now, in fairness, a lot of these technical violations resulted after a parolee was arrested, perhaps for a crime, and instead of the sheriff and the police charging a new crime and the prosecutor deciding whether to prosecute it, the parole people just decided to send that person back. How many of those people really were committing a burglary or getting ready to commit a robbery or involved in drug sales, or the various things that may have led them to get arrested? We don't know, is the strict answer. But parole revocation sentences were very short. The most you can be sent, even before this change of realignment, the most you could be sent back on a parole violation for was a year for the most serious charges. Much more typically, you would spend an average of 4 or 5 months. And this was a big source of the chaos in California prisons, as lots of parolees were coming back all the time. About 100,000 people a year were coming out of California prisons on parole, and about that many every year were coming back on parole violations. So it was a real mess, and certainly not a very effective deterrent form of incapacitation, let alone rehabilitation. But it did generate a lot of bodies in prison. And this is designed to prevent that, or to reduce a lot of that. As of October 1st, 2011, if you're one of those, not serious, not violent, not sex offender felons, and you don't have some other reason that makes them think you ought to be on a higher level of parole supervision on your release, you are essentially excluded from state parole, and you are put, as you can see here, on a form of post-release supervision that essentially is going to be managed by the counties. And you will not be subject to revocation by way of being returned to the state prison for parole violations. Now, if you commit a new crime and you get charged by your local district attorney and convicted in county court, yes, you'll go back to state prison. Otherwise, and this is the third move, you'll be subject to a variety of decisions by your local county supervising agencies, which will have the power to dispose of all kinds of violations with a variety of tools that were not traditionally used by state parole. And some of these are clearly part of the move toward trying to find alternatives to heavy reliance on incarceration, although some of them involve selected use of incarceration. So one of these sort of new approaches is called flash incarceration. It's really a recycling of an idea that's been around since at least the 80s, and that is the idea that maybe a sort of quick trip to the jail will be enough to kind of deter you if you're, say, turning in dirty drug tests, or contrary to orders from your probation officer, you're hanging out with your former gang friends in your old neighborhood. Instead of doing nothing or sending you back to state prison, which was the old mechanism, this flash incarceration idea is, let's spend a weekend in the county jail. See if that kind of resets your clock a little bit in terms of and gets you back on track. But these agencies will have wide discretion to do other things, to impose different kinds of fines, community work or service requirements. Again, things like restorative justice, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. So that's just a little overview of realignment. And the main sort of point about realignment for today that I want to emphasize is that for the most part, it involves moving people that would have been in the prison population, as blue, and here you see the national correctional population figures, prison, jail, parole, probation, from 1980 to 2008. And part of what you can see here is that the growth of prisons, which has preoccupied us in the last few weeks, is really part of just a giant expansion in the correctional population as a whole. Even though a lot of people went to prison who weren't going to prison before, lots of people went to jail, and indeed probation, which is the most common form of criminal justice sanction, grew even faster than prison does. And we've got literally close to 10, we treat the whole correctional population. We just talk about prison, we've got about, and jail, we've got about 2 million people in prison and jail. But if we talk about the whole correctional population, we've got closer to 10 million. And obviously for certain segments of the population, a majority of people are on some form of correctional supervision. But my point about that today is that realignment, insofar as it's really saying, right, you can't keep so many people in prison, you've got to move them to these other statuses, raises a lot of questions because of the fact that during this long period of the rise of mass incarceration, a lot of what was sustaining and maintaining this great growth in imprisonment was in fact people coming from parole and probation and jail back to prison. Historically, parole and probation had been invented in the progressive era. We talked a little bit about this as a way to sort of replace the old prison labor idea, which disciplined people with labor inside prisons with the promise of getting out early if they could improve their rehabilitative prospects through various kinds of treatment or simply good behavior in prison. The original idea for parole was if you can rehabilitate people, get them on the road to rehabilitation, move them back into the community where they're likely to have better resources to finish their rehabilitation. They can work in a real job, they can have the effects of their family, but they can continue to have the steadying hand of law on them. Probation was a very similar idea, but a little bit more comprehensive in a way. Instead of sending someone to prison to begin with, you could put them on probation, which would be that kind of supervised treatment and to some extent punishment insofar as your probation officer might tell you can't drink, you can't go to parties, you can't be out after 10 p.m. or maybe you have a curfew that's even earlier. There's a punitive element to it. In any event, they were intended to be alternatives to incarceration, but during this period of time, they, in a sense, instead of being an alternative or a way out of incarceration in the case of parole, they became really a kind of a rotation around incarceration, a way of keeping people kind of cycling in and out of incarceration. So in many states, during these long decades, people who would be charged with a felony might be offered probation as a plea bargain. This was very true in Florida when I lived there in the 90s. When I worked with the public defender's office at looking at some of the reasons so many people were going to prison, lots of these folks got probation as a deal, as a plea bargain, and they would think, oh great, I'm free, I'm out of prison, I'm not going to have to face trial. But what would happen is they would commit a minor violation, maybe violate the curfew laws or be picked up with a container in their car, etc. And instead of getting a few days in the jail or charged with a new crime, they would have their probation violated. And unlike California parole, where the violation results in a 5 or 6 month sentence, in Florida and in many other states, if your probation is violated, you can be sentenced by the court to serve the full sentence in prison that you would have served for the crime that you pled guilty to. So suddenly, instead of spending a few weeks or nights in jail for a minor violation, you're in state prison for a robbery or a burglary term, which could be 5 or 10 years. So this whole picture in the 80s and 90s became one of a correctional population that was essentially feeding the prison system and not an alternative to it. And that really sort of sharpens the question I want to think about with you today and to some extent on Thursday when we talk about restorative justice. And that is whether these moves that we see in realignment toward more emphasis on alternatives to incarceration like parole and probation can be a promising way to kind of rebalance our system away from mass incarceration with a commitment to preventing the prison population from blowing up again, or whether it's kind of what I like to call sort of a suitcase solution. If you're carrying a really heavy suitcase in one hand, an excellent solution is to move it to the other hand for a while, and that feels good for about 5 minutes, and then you need to switch it back. And we might be in one of those moments where the prison is under a lot of criticism right now and under a lot of pressure to reduce prison populations. Maybe what we're going to do is swell our jail population and our probation population, but after there's a few nasty armed robberies or kidnappings, God forbid rapes or murders, there'll be a demand for sending more of these folks back to prison, and a lot of that population which never really escaped our reach because they remained in the correctional population will simply be moved back into prison. Now, one of the challenges I think we face in making realignment a meaningful opportunity to rebalance the system comes from confronting what mass incarceration has done in terms of the way it has concentrated incarceration as essentially a new form of disadvantage in communities that are already burdened with great disadvantages. And this is from the reading I asked you to do for last week from Robert Sampson and Charles Loeffler on the whole question of the local concentration of mass incarceration. This is a very important point for me about one of the myths, if you will, of prison in our era, is that prison is sort of a uniform and equalizing form of state public safety investment. When we build a prison and we fill it with prisoners, we are reducing crime everywhere in the state by virtue of things like deterrence and incapacitation, and however much or little that does to reduce crime. That's a benefit that all Californians are going to share in, and the burdens of it are going to be shared by all Californians as well. But of course, when we look at how incarceration really operates, we find that that's not true, that certain communities, if we looked at a map, say, of Oakland or any city, and we looked at it, sort of neighborhood by neighborhood, how much incarceration is going on from this neighborhood, that is how many people who would normally be on the street here in this neighborhood and living in these apartments or houses, how many of them are off in prison. And we represented that on a graph. What you would see is something that looked a lot like Manhattan, a bar graph with lots of very tall bars representing those neighborhoods that have very high levels of poverty. And many areas that are more affluent would have very little incarceration going on. So from that point of view, incarceration is far from a uniformly distributed benefit or burden. Now, you might look at it as an advantage. Communities that have a lot of disadvantages and also have a lot of crime are getting a lot of incarceration. And if that is helping them reduce crime, that might actually be a good thing for them. But part of what sociologists have begun to realize is that instead, mass incarceration, as it concentrates in certain neighborhoods, may actually be driving crime, and to some extent is driving itself, is driving more. So incarceration yields more incarceration. In any event, this is a very powerful this figure here, which is figure 4 from their article, is a very powerful documentation that incarceration in its concentration in cities does not follow simply crime. You might think high crime neighborhood, high incarceration neighborhood. And to some extent, you'd be right. There is a relationship between crime and incarceration. But as this chart shows, there's a lot of variation. So here you have, on this horizontal axis here, low, medium, and high crime areas. As you can, not surprisingly, in general, the high crime areas have higher levels of incarceration. But notice that within each area, these are broken down into bars that reflect disadvantage, economic and social disadvantage in those neighborhoods. The black bars have high disadvantage. The medium is the kind of check, and the low disadvantage is the gray bars. And as you can see, whether you're in a high crime neighborhood or a low crime neighborhood or in between, there's less incarceration in those neighborhoods that have less social disadvantage. And part of what that's telling us is that while crime is sending people to prison, so is disadvantage. It's sending them at a higher rate. Now, that could be because police are concentrating on a kind of racial profiling basis their attention on those communities that have already great disadvantages, partly because racial segregation tracks other forms of disadvantage and discrimination in our society. But it could also be because many of the same kinds of social processes that make and constitute the disadvantage of those neighborhoods also feed incarceration. So just to take one from our discussion last week, dropping out of high school, not only is dropping out of high school likely to make you poorer down the road, but it's also raising the odds you're going to be in prison. Because when you're not in that building called high school, it's easier for the police to get you, it's easier for gang activities to encompass you, and in general, it's going to raise incarceration. So crime is part of what drives incarceration, but so is concentrated disadvantage. Part of what they point out here is what they call the reciprocal interaction, whereby community vulnerability and incarceration are involved in a negative feedback loop. That is, you might think incarceration by reducing crime would, over time, reduce the level of incarceration in that neighborhood. And that makes sense, and it probably is happening to some extent. But at the same time, to the extent that incarceration is also increasing the disadvantages of those neighborhoods, that's also going to drive more incarceration independently of the crime factor. And the crucial question, obviously, is whether the crime-reducing aspects of incarceration are outstripping the disadvantage-producing aspects, or vice versa. I think my own belief, and I think most criminologists now would believe, the disadvantage-producing aspects of incarceration are outstripping the crime-reducing aspects. So how would that work in practice? Think about somebody who's a mid-level drug trafficking employee, working as part of some drug-selling organization. Now, they're causing crime in their neighborhood to some extent, yes, right? Because if those drugs are being sold illegally in that neighborhood, that's a crime. They may or may not be generating other kinds of crime in that neighborhood. For instance, the violent pattern of shooting incidents between rival drug teams or organizations was one of the major causes of violent crime spiking in the late 80s and early 90s. However, in recent years, although drug sales are just as constant in big cities, drug sales have moved toward a new, more indoor sale model because of cell phones and the internet and other things like that. And so there's just less violence associated with the drug trade. None of that is to suggest that the drug trade is a great thing for these neighborhoods, but that individual who's slinging drugs